Enterprise Institute, and I'm very pleased and proud to welcome you to this important event at an important time. We are here today to launch American Renewal, a conservative plan to strengthen the social contract and save the country's finances, co-edited by former Speaker Paul Ryan and AEI's Angela Rachidi. We couldn't be doing this at a more pivotal time in our country, where I think clearly we're facing up to the fact that we've made commitments that we cannot afford in the long term. And former Speaker Ryan came to AEI in part to assemble a group of scholars, guide them, inspire them, lead them, edit them, and put together a volume like this that charts a path forward with ideas for a new time and a new period that are desperately needed. So we're very proud to be doing this event, to be heralding this work, and to have Speaker Ryan with us. I don't have to introduce him. I will introduce him in a minute, a little bit of detail, but I just want to say the way we're going to do this is the speaker's going to speak, then he and I and his co-editor, Angela Rachidi, are going to engage in a conversation, and then we're going to take a little break. We will take questions from the audience, but then we'll take a little break, and then a second panel of distinguished speakers will join us for further discussion. So just to say, what can I say about Speaker Ryan? There's not much that no one doesn't already know. I'll just give you one little detail. Speaker Ryan is a giant in public policy. He's been around this town for a long time, and he's done great things. But he hasn't lost his common touch and his ability to relate to people as individuals. And that was evident the other night. AEI had its big annual dinner, and everybody was in tuxedos. And my wife, who is new to this world and was a little starstruck, was sitting near the speaker. And she noticed that not only did Speaker Ryan greet all of the guests, all of the people in their tuxedos, but he greeted and knew details about all of the people that were serving at the table and engaged with them in a very human and positive way. And that's the kind of person you are. In addition, you've put together this wonderful book. Speaker Ryan, take the floor.
Thank you very much, Robert. I really appreciate it. It is great to be here. Actually, the think tank world is a much more pleasant life and place to be these days than the old world I used to have. As you can see, my hair is actually less gray than it used to be, and that is not for artificial coloring. Look, with elections behind us and with what I like to call the silly season sort of over with now, I cannot think of a better time and a better place to start doing the hard work of policy development than doing it right here at the American Enterprise Institute. I want to thank all of these book authors for their hard work on this volume. I think that this volume should provide a great roadmap for conservative policymakers as they begin their new journey, and I just came from the Hill, as they begin their new journey building their new majority. The gavel is going to be voted on and handed out the week after Thanksgiving. People are going to be assembling their staffs and their committees, and then on this new majority, as thin as it may be, will go. We wanted to do this volume, frankly, because America emerged from the 20th century as the world's sole superpower, and we created a material prosperity that the world had never seen before. But we are now facing enormous political and economic challenges, both from within and from without. We are being challenged by China's repressive regime, and Russia is yet again seeking to impose its totalitarian vision on unwilling countries. Huge challenges they are. The U.S. also faces enormous internal challenges. Our fiscal policy is on a collision course with our monetary policy. And the economic devastation resulting from a debt crisis could truly inflict irreparable damage to our citizens and to our economy. And while we have previously seen a buildup of large national debt, we've seen big deficits before, the manner and the circumstances we face today are unique and different. We are not fighting a war. We're not coming out of a massive fiscal economic crisis, and we do not have a baby boom coming around the corner. We are shifting toward a grayer, older society. We are right now, as a government, making promises that we right now know we cannot keep. And unless we change course, and unless we change course soon, we face a series of increasingly unappealing policy choices. Cuts to programs seniors rely on, massive tax increases on the middle class, a hollowed-out military at a time when we have massive foreign policy challenges, and an increasingly angry citizenry frustrated that the promises of their government that were made to them are not being kept. If you think we're polarized today, just see what it would look like then. But I'm here with good news. The good news is these problems are all absolutely solvable. We aren't helpless before these challenges. It just is a matter of summoning the will to do so. We do not need to break our promises to our seniors. We can and should maintain a vibrant social safety net, and we can have broadly shared prosperity in this country and upward mobility. But the day is well gone. We cannot achieve these things if we are not willing to start doing the hard work today. And it is that spirit that we have produced this book, The American Renewal, a conservative plan to save the nation's finances and strengthen the social contract. That is our attempt to get this debate going, to offer ideas and solutions, not just platitudes. It's a comprehensive look at the policies governing our nation. It provides concrete steps we can take to improve people's lives. Let's start with tax reform. First, it discusses the 21st century tax code. I actually look at the best achievement of my own personal career is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's one of the things that I take great pride in. It made substantial improvements on the current tax code, but even the best laws can be improved. Alex Brill and Kyle Palmerlew proposed reforms to both the individual and the business tax systems that would improve economic growth and lead to a broader, more neutral and simpler tax base that would get upward mobility ignited again in America. Sound money. This is something that we're going to hear a lot about in the debates to come. The U.S. has been the reserve currency in the post-World War II era. This gives us an exorbitant privilege, one that we are not taking as seriously as we need to. And while fiscal policy is threatening the status of our reserve currency, we also face new challenges from digital currencies in the offing. Kevin Warsh is one of the outsiders we allowed in the tent here at AEI, a Hoover guy. Kevin Warsh proposes that we create a new wholesale digital dollar framework to intermediate dollar payments between the U.S. government and providers of our banking services. A properly structured CBDC, central bank digital currency, will help us maintain dollar supremacy. The social safety net. That's something we spent a lot of time working on here at AEI. Nick Eberstadt describes a new misery spreading in America where the bottom half of household wealth continues to fall and lower income Americans come to depend on means-tested benefits throughout the entirety of their lives. As such, Angela Rachidi, our co-editor on this book, along with Matt Weidinger and Scott Winship, propose a comprehensive overhaul that builds a safety net for the 21st century that promotes work and strong families. It combines the earned income tax credit along with the child tax credit into one credit that will be much simpler and help with raising children. And they also fundamentally reimagine the relationship between states and their roles in all of this to encourage innovation. Child welfare and paid leave. We also look at ways we can both support the most vulnerable populations among us. With Naomi Schaefer-Riley, we discuss how we can improve the child welfare system. We'll get into that as well today. Abby McCloskey lays out ways we can support working mothers through a new paid leave system. Education and training, a real clincher if we're going to get upward mobility reignited in this country. Taking one of the most difficult issues we face, Max Eden, Frederick Hess, and Brent Orrell, they proposed a specific agenda for family-centered early childhood education, K-12 schooling, and workforce training. The education system, from early childhood to adulthood, is one of the key ways people interact with their government, and it's one of the ways we are failing those who need the system the most. The education system's ability to improve upward mobility in this country cannot be overstated, and so we have well-honed recommendations in this area. Civil society. I would be remiss if we did not have a long talk about civil society and its proper role in our place in society. Civil society remains probably the key, probably the best way to transform people's lives. Howard Hussick proposes a number of ways that we can strengthen civil society. The social contract. Finally, we come to the broad social contract: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, health and retirement security for Americans. These vexing issues are massive drivers of individual well-being as well as government spending. They are the primary drivers of this coming debt crisis. Jim Capretta reimagines what a Medicare program that is vibrant and solvent looks like, providing for more choice and competition. It is the chief way we can both improve outcomes while also reducing costs and bringing solvency. Thomas Miller looks at Medicaid reforms by allowing greater innovation in the Medicaid program and per capita allotments. Andrew Biggs, he protects retirement security by looking abroad and finding wisdom in what other countries are doing to promote retirement savings to offer a better solvent system for American workers and their families. And finally, Richard Burkhauser, he looks at ways to improve work incentives for individuals on disability and bringing solvency to that program as well. There are a lot of specifics in this book. I'm not sure that it's going to be sold at all of your airports or be made into a movie. There are a lot of good, dense policy prescriptions in this book. And I just want to thank Angela Rachidi, our co-editor, with a solid second and help from Peyton Roth, wherever Peyton is. Thank you very, very much for all of your hard work in doing this. What I hope to get out of this is to give conservative policymakers the space and the ability to start thinking creatively about how best to help and serve the American people. What is consistent among all of these policies is that our current government was mostly designed in the 20th century in ways that are proving unsustainable in the 21st century. We can fulfill the promise of these programs by making prudent reforms. Or we could be the first generation ever in the history of our country to sever our legacy by leaving the next generation worse off. We can take prudent steps to repair our safety net and raise living standards. Or we can watch as our citizens become much more frustrated and much less prosperous. What we cannot do is say that we were not warned. And that is what is before us. We know that we have challenges, but we also know that there are solutions to those challenges. And if we meet the challenges before us, if we stomach the will, muster the political consensus, get things done, then we will remain the greatest country on earth. It is just a matter of will. So what we're trying to do here is to get this debate up and running and off and going. Thank you again, and I very much look forward to our conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul, for that kickoff and start. I think, as you may recognize by Paul's remarks and by looking at the book, is it really is a collection of really great scholars who do great work in a very technical way. And it's a heavy book, and it's got a lot of details, and it's got a lot of specifics. It's a serious book, and that's a good thing, because I think Paul is saying, or I'm saying, or I think we think at AEI, that it's time to tackle these issues in a serious way with a real focus on outcomes that will serve our country well. I want to start with you, Angela. Angela and I have known each other a long time. Angela worked with me when I was in New York City working for Mike Bloomberg as the Commissioner of Social Services. Angela was the Director of Research and Evaluation. And for now, almost 9 years, you've been a scholar here covering these issues. SNAP, you're probably the foremost expert on SNAP, foremost expert on TANF. You write a lot about childcare. You've done some outstanding work since you've been here. And then Paul recruited you to help in putting this thing together, because as you may have noticed, that list of scholars, you know, they have to be herded, they have to be gathered. And Angela, you really helped a lot with that. So what I want to ask you, is someone who is identified like other scholars here at AEI, as someone who watched what happened in the wake of welfare reform in the 1990s and saw the benefits of a reform that both saved money and led to better outcomes for families, especially poor single-parent families. Not talking about that again, but where do you see that lesson applying to some of the proposals in the other programs that are in this book? Is there a work and a savings aspect in what's in this book?
Yes, it's a great question. So Scott Winship, Matt Whitinger, and I wrote the chapter on the safety net. And part of the reason we had 3 authors is because we did decide to take a look at the system as a whole, not look at it as piecemeal, like TANF separately, SNAP separately, and disability assistance, for example. And our starting place really was welfare reform, because I think it's fairly uncontroversial at this point, given all the research we have, to say that welfare reform was not only transformational, but it was likely one of the most successful social policy transformations in our social policy history. So that was really our starting place of how do we build upon the success from welfare reform. And as you mentioned, the research now shows, and even a few recent studies that came out, shows that welfare reform did lead to child poverty reductions, increase in employment among single mothers, and better outcomes for kids and their mothers as well over time, like lower food insecurity, better health outcomes, things like that. So we do look to welfare reform as kind of a guide to what we can do. But in doing that for our proposed reforms on the safety net, we could have really taken 2 approaches. One is to say, let's take the successful components of welfare reform, work requirements, time limits, and let's just apply all of that to all of the other safety net programs. That's one approach, and actually I think all 3 of us have talked about doing that in the past. But when we really sort of discussed how should we design a safety net for the next generation, we knew we had to get, it was more than just that, we knew we had to get 2 things right. One was changing sort of the financial architecture of how these programs operate. Currently, these programs, with the exception of TANF, are almost 100% federally funded. So states have very little incentive to actually achieve a positive outcome being reduced dependency, so getting people off of these programs, because it's kind of a perverse incentive for them, because then they would lose federal dollars coming into their state. So the incentives are all wrong. So what we propose is to change that financial architecture and to have states finance 50% of the balance of the safety net. TANF, not only TANF, but SNAP and disability assistance as well. So that was one problem we wanted to address. And it is a big change, but we wanted to add to that the ability for states to build on what we learned from welfare reform. So we kind of propose a super waiver, which may be a term coined by the speaker, but to allow states to combine programs and to have more flexibility in designing how these programs can better serve families and result in more positive outcomes. And so that places a lot of responsibility on the states, but it reduces the requirement that the federal government is the entity that comes in and says, you must have a work requirement, you must have a time limit. It more lets states impose those provisions as they see fit. And then just finally, to add to that, the federal government, in our view of a reformed safety net, still plays a major role. We believe that the federal government should do what it's best at doing, which is transferring income to low-income families. So the federal government would still have a responsibility for providing tax credits to working families. It would be tied to work, only available to working families. And we actually propose reforming the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit so that it not only supports work better, but it also supports marriage. Because in our overarching argument is that the safety net must be set up to both support work and marriage.
So Paul, I think you're the former chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, chairman of the Budget Committee, Speaker of the House. Issues concerning entitlement reform for the benefits of preserving our fiscal strength as a country have been something you've cared about your entire career. Mm-hmm. And there's 2 ways to do that. One is to make some reductions in the long-term spending paths, and the other is to find ways to either change or enhance the revenue coming into the federal government. one of the things that's in the book, in the tax chapter, that's interesting, and I wanted to get you talking about, is your proposal concerning a border adjustment carbon tax. And why did the authors come to that? Why do you like that idea? What will it do for revenues for the government, and what does it say about your attitude about climate change?
Yeah, so Kyle and Alex and I spent a lot of time talking about this. Those are the two authors of this proposal. Number one, which I'll start with the back of it. So do I think we should move toward decarbonizing our economy? I do. So what's the smartest way to do that? It's not what we're doing now. It's not green pork, picking winners and losers in Washington, industrial policy, subsidizing yesterday's technology, which is basically what's happening right now. I think the smarter way to do this is to send price signals on carbon through the tax system so that the market can solve this problem with innovations. And in that way, you're not trading economic growth for decarbonization. They move hand in hand together. That's point number one. Point number two is my argument, our argument here, is for conservatives to participate in this issue, here is our price of poker. We want a supply-side pro-growth tax system in exchange. So we're saying, if you want us to help, and this is a political statement I'm making, help decarbonize the economy, we agree. Let's do it in a way that sends the price signals globally, border adjusting, therefore China and India are participating in this, whether they like it or not. And second, let's use the revenue we get from that carbon tax to give us a much better pro-growth supply-side tax code, which is a cash flow border adjustment tax, a cash flow destination tax, excuse me, Kyle. He's going to nod if I get it wrong. And what that means is we can lower our tax rate on our business entities down to 15%, full expensing, which is effectively a consumption tax. And they propose streamlining the way businesses are taxed so it's just one entity. You don't have all these different kinds of rules and schedules, sub-S, LLC, sole proprietor, C Corp, 15%, full expensing. It is a massively pro-growth tax code. To pay for that, and we propose a lot of reforms on the individual side to still have a progressive tax rate system, but a more collapsed system that's more pro-growth, that also is pro-charity and civil society, combined with these reforms of the EITC and the CTC. But to pay for all of that, we think throw a carbon tax on top of it so you can hit your revenue line, which is a revenue-neutral revenue line off the baseline. And we think the smarter carbon policy is to send price signals through the code. And our argument here is this is better carbon policy, it's better environmental policy, and oh, by the way, it's really good pro-growth tax policy that makes American businesses extremely globally competitive, which will help raise wages, raise productivity, and raise living standards and ignite upward mobility.
And just to follow up on that, that's a question that has been in active discussion, as I understand it, in the Congress and especially in the Senate. And so this contribution of your position and of this paper can help move that along, or am I wrong? Is that something that could actually happen?
That's the idea here. That's exactly the idea. So I think, again, the smart way to decarbonize is to not make people poorer, is to not raise all of their prices. It is to send the right price signals through the market economy like you do with a carbon tax. And the goal, in my mind, it's not, there's a lot of people who like cap and trade and things like this. I don't think those are good ideas. The goal here is to buy yourself a better tax system so you can have faster economic growth.
So while we're on issues that are sort of new and emerging, let's talk about central bank digital currency. Speaker, you have some experience in that topic. It's something that you've been working on and thinking about. What's in this volume about that and about a payment system or a different way of distributing benefits from the federal government?
Yeah, I spent a good deal of time with Kevin Warsh, so we went to a Hoover guy, but sorry about that too.
It just shows how generous I am that I'm allowed to, I bring that up just.
Right, so, but Kevin was also a Federal Reserve Board.
He's a great guy.
The director of board, governor. And so, how do I set this up? I want to be as efficient with words as possible. The world is going to digital. Currencies are going digital. Whether crypto is there or not, that's really not the point here. China is already digitizing the RMB, their currency. And they are doing it more or less, I would argue, to put their people under their digital police state so that they can monitor their money and control their money and surveil their money. And that is a central bank retail currency. But what they will do is not only will they put their own people under this system, they will go market this to the Belt Road countries. Because the advantage a country or a currency gets with a digital currency is it's frictionless. Think about the trillions of dollars that are spent on transferring money through the pipes and the rails that we have today, which is 4 to 6% of your money moving around the world is taken away from that to pay for all the intermediary fees that are charged from bank to bank to bank to bank to move through the system. You go digital, you remove that friction. That is trillions of dollars that are freed up for economic growth and efficiency. So this is going to happen, I would argue. It's pretty clear. And so the question in our mind's eye, and I don't want to speak necessarily for Kevin, is does the free world have an alternative to what China is offering? Because we know other central banks are going down this path. The Euro, they have a big ECB project as well. So the question is, does America, today the keeper of the world's reserve currency, which we hope will maintain that reserve currency status, does America, on behalf of the free world, offer an alternative? And so how you design this really matters. And that is why what Kevin Warsh is proposing is a wholesale two-tier system so that the Fed is at the wholesale level, like it is today, where it gives Federal Reserve dollars to its clearing banks and to non-banks, and they operate at the retail level. So you have a very important legal wall of separation between a person and their central bank so that there can be no government meddling in the management of money, but that we can have a competitive product with the rest of the world where we have frictionless money so that we can get the benefits of the efficiencies of digital money, but that we maintain a system that preserves our privacy and our liberties as human beings and gives the rest of the world the benefits of a digital payment system without the tyranny of China. That will help us lead and make sure that we maintain our world reserve currency status if we get our fiscal house in order, which is the purpose of the rest of this book.
And another issue that is actively being discussed by both parties in Congress now and is sort of waiting to be resolved, and the contribution of the volume keeps that moving, gives that a little energy. Angela, one way of looking at the public policy debate about social services or aid to poor families in the past year and a half is that the Democrats very much wanted to expand the child tax credit and pay it regardless of whether anybody did any work or had any earnings to every family in America. And they put a lot of emphasis on that. It was the highest priority of the Build Back Better Act that President Biden proposed. And then over time, as discussion occurred around that and Americans came face to face with something that was giving federal assistance in the way the old welfare system did to families regardless of whether they worked or addressed their underlying circumstances, Congress, through Senator Manchin's decision-making process, decided they weren't going to do that. My first question is, where do you come down? Where does this volume come down on this child tax credit? Should we be paying, as the federal government, a universal benefit to families with children just because they have children, regardless of whether they work?
Well, the first answer to your question in terms of where I come down, so there was this sort of misunderstanding about what the child tax credit is in that whole debate that you just described. They sort of, the Democrats sold it as, look, the child tax credit exists, but it misses this large group of people who are the poorest of the poor because they're not working. This program currently misses them. We need to expand it to them. But it sort of missed the balance of the safety net, which is billions of dollars that is set up exactly for those families. So that was sort of a misunderstanding. And so what they were trying to do is exactly what you said, is take us back to a system where you are paying people not to work. And I think where I come down on that is that would be returning us to a pre-welfare reform environment that we know from a lot of research was not effective at all. It did not help families move up the income ladder. It actually trapped them in poverty, and we did not have good outcomes for children or their parents. So that, in my mind, was entirely the wrong way to go. I understand the desire desire to want to have our government programs properly targeted, so they should be targeted to the poorest families. But what we propose in our chapter is that in order to do that, you need to focus on two key components, which is employment. So if a family is not working, our policies need to be designed to help them into the labor market, to help them work. And then the other component is family. We know from the data that children are much less likely to be in poverty if they have two adults in the household. Typically in a married situation. So our policies need to reflect that and encourage both employment and two-parent child raising.
Paul, we've got an article in the volume by Rich Burkhauser, the foremost expert on disability benefits. We have chapters by Jim Capretta and Tom Miller on healthcare. In those two broad areas, areas which you've worked on and thought about for a long time, what are the ideas in either of those or both of those that come top to mind, or that you want to make sure our guests hear?
The biggest fiscal needle mover is what Capretta is offering for premium support for Medicare. There is no greater reform that would do more to help improve the Medicare program and dodge the bullet of a debt crisis. CBO now finally, with their long-term model that they finally put into place a number of years ago, will show you can make the program work better by giving choice and competition of plans to compete against each other for that beneficiary's business. And then the government subsidizes that beneficiary based on how wealthy or poor or healthy they are. Less for the wealthy, less for the healthy, more for the poor, more for the sick. You can adjust that benefit. That act of choice and competition, which we know very, very well, Part D works as a premium support system. The federal employee benefit health system works as a premium support system. That reform in and of itself right there, frankly, and with some other reforms that Jim has proposed on how we treat the trust funds, will do more in and of itself to wipe trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities off the books, and to give us a predictable growth rate for that program, by which the bond markets, I would argue, would reward us for dealing with this issue once and for all and helping us dodge that moment in the bond markets where we could truly have a cataclysmic debt crisis kind of an event. On the Burkhauser work point with disability, if you look at the disability program, and I spent a lot of time when I was chair of doing this, there are a lot of people who go on the disability program who can do other jobs than the one that they were working at before. And so you want to encourage that. So we want to have a system. I remember I had a buddy from Janesville, Wisconsin, who was an electrician. He fell 2 stories, broke his back, was paralyzed from his sternum on down, obviously couldn't be an electrician again, and he was on disability. And in that year, I think he made $1,070 a month. And we have another buddy of ours from Janesville, Wisconsin, who's a CPA. And he said, why don't you help me just do tax preparation? I'm so swamped, and I'll pay you $4,000 a month if you just help me do tax preparation, learn how to do this. As soon as he got into doing this, because he could type and he could think, he just couldn't be an electrician. If he made $1,070 a month, no problem, you can keep your disability payments, make that. If you make $1,071 a month, you lose your disability program. It was absolutely, utterly ridiculous. And this is why, back in those days, I started working this benefit offset feature, which is voluntarily, if you work for every $3, and there's different benefit offset mechanisms you can do, if you work for every $3 you earn, you just lose $1 in benefit, and then you can go up and down and regulate it. It was like the end of the world when we proposed this. So the point I'm trying to make is what Richard is proposing are good ways of shoring up this program and giving people on disability the freedom and the ability to do some work. Here's the clincher in these work issues. We talked about work in all these different benefit designs. The CBO is projecting that our long-term growth rate for America for the 21st century will be 1.6% GDP. It was 3% and change in the 20th century. The difference in opportunity, in upward mobility, in people getting out of poverty, in prosperity, in innovation, and entrepreneurship, and jobs being created and businesses being launched between 1.6% and 3% is enormous. And so why do we have such lower GDP projections? projections. The primary reason is because of labor, workforce participation, less people working. And so if we can maximize the ability for able-bodied people in America to join the workforce, not only do they help themselves and get themselves out of poverty and enjoy the best version of their lives, they can help all the rest of us by helping move that needle of GDP up closer to 3%. You top that off with smart immigration reform, with our 2.1 birth rates, which need to be about 2.4, and we can have one whale of a great century. We can have the labor we need without depressing people's wages, with raising wages, if we get this right. But a key component of that is getting able-bodied people and people with certain disabilities who can do other jobs working.
So there's, so much in this volume that we can't all cover now, and we've got a second panel. Howard Husak has a great chapter, Andrew Biggs has a great chapter. But there's one chapter that I want to call attention to, and I want, Angela, you to address it as this last question before I open it up to the audience. 2 days ago, there was an awful child fatality in New York City, a place that you and I both know well. A child who was known to the foster care system and the child protective system for years, from the day she was born, is in the homeless shelter system as well. And due to either pressures or policies that have sort of pushed, I think our author on this subject, Naomi Schaefer-Riley, would say, that have pushed the system to rush to return children to their families, even when they're very dangerous circumstances, partly motivated by kind of a woke concern about race. In this case, the child was returned to the family, and now the 3-year-old is dead. I would ask you, can you give us a little sense of what Naomi is trying to say in that chapter and why you think it's so important?
Sure, and Naomi is here. And so, I mean, I give Naomi a lot of credit. She's been writing about this issue for a number of years. She wrote a book about this topic, and she has a wonderful chapter in our book. And so I encourage everybody to read it. But yes, she makes the point that, I mean, our child welfare system is set up to is supposed to protect the most vulnerable children in our society. It really is. I mean, these are children who are in extremely difficult home environments, who are facing abuse and neglect, and that is the government entity that is supposed to be protecting them. Naomi argues, and I completely agree with her based on all of the work that she's done, that that system has completely lost its way. It is not, the aim of that system is no longer to protect children. It is about pushing a social agenda. It's about protecting the parents over the needs of the children. And much of this happens at the state level. These are systems that are operated at the state level. And so we need the states to shift gears and refocus on, like I said, the most vulnerable children. And how can we all just sit back and watch this happen and watch the parents' needs be put ahead of these very vulnerable children? And it's unfortunate that what happened in New York City, we see it come up at least 2-3 times a year, Naomi. I mean, it keeps coming up over and over again, these children who are not only just a few touches with the system, but multiple touches with the system. And yet the system is designed to care more about the parents and about how they are perceived or if they feel discriminated against, and put the needs of those parents above the needs of the children. And so again, I encourage everybody to read not only Naomi's chapter, but all of the work that she's been doing, because to me, if we can't even get that right, if our government system can't even get that right, then we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and I would just say there had been a lot of progress on this in the past, and it's been reversed in the last 10 or 5 or 10 years, where there's been this obsession and a concern about a perceived racial bias of the system that has led judges and systems to be pushed to move children back into homes where they're really not safe. Okay, I want to call on questions from the audience. And let's see, we have one right there, front row.
Hi, Carl Polzer. I have a little project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity, and I fight for the bottom 50%, who I think a group that's been largely neglected. So on the child tax credit, one point I made is that It's unfair, the way it is now.
And we want a question.
No, I know, but I have to put the premise out.
Okay, okay.
I had to introduce myself, that's
That,
all.
that was good. I just want to make sure. I forgot to say, you like
All
questions.
right, no, it's
It's okay.
data. So families making 400,000, 150,000 get 4,000 in the child tax credit now under the current system. Families making 15 to 20,000 get about half that. That's not progressive, that's not even a flat benefit. Wouldn't it be fairer to flip that around? And if not, why not just get rid of the child tax credit altogether, since most of it's going to people that don't need it?
That's
a question.
It's actually a good question about the child tax credit. The extent to which it goes
Yeah, it
pretty
should be
far.
capped, it should be capped more, I agree with that, but to Angela's point, I'll turn it over to her. What you do not want to do is turn it into a UBI benefit that pays people not to work. That is the biggest disaster you could make, which we were like, I think, one vote away from that occurring. So I agree with capping it at a smarter level.
I mean, the history of the child tax credit, I mean, it originally was enacted in 1997 because the personal exemption was not keeping pace with inflation. And so it started out as a very small tax credit, meaning people who had tax.
Yeah, it
who
wasn't
had
refundable,
income-
it was $500.
Right, it was income tax liability, they got a credit off their taxes. Over time, it's become something much more. And so in just, kind of a counter argument to what you're saying, it was never intended to be a program for the bottom in the income distribution, because we have other programs for that population. The earned income tax credit is much larger than the child tax credit, and it's targeted specifically to that population. So, again, when we discuss the child tax credit, too often it's discussed in a silo, as if no other programs exist. I would argue that the tax credit should return to some of their original purposes, which is part of the tax code, to offset tax liability, make it refundable for the earned income tax credit. That's fine because it is a good work incentive, it encourages work. But if we're talking about the most vulnerable families, we need policies that connect them to work, which is why those policies work. And if they're not connected to work, just sending them money, I think, is the wrong approach, because there's no opportunity for capacity building, for example, and things like that.
It's about the fairness of what the wealthier.
Well, I'm saying there's a bet that you can't think of it as only the child tax credit. And the reason it goes up to $400,000 income now is because it replaced the personal exemption.
Yes, sir, in the back. Right there. Right there. Sure.
JP Hogan. When ACA and Obamacare was at the Supreme Court, they argued it was needed because you couldn't control state spillover, like Vermont sending their sick to Massachusetts. How does the open border then not be unconstitutional if they're letting millions in? So how would you control spillover as a national versus Obamacare's state spillover was justified?
I'm not sure I get
I'm not-
the
I'm not-
question. I mean, we don't deal with immigration in this. It's not, we didn't do immigration reform in here.
Call them legal citizens now to some extent, so they're wanting the.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with the Biden border policy, no two ways about it, but that's not something we deal with in this book. We don't have immigration in this book. I get your point.
I was speaking of it's contradictory law. If you say you need Obamacare at the national level because you can't control the spillover state to state.
Yeah, right.
How do you then allow those people to say, well, we can keep the border open?
We disagree with that.
Yes, over here.
Yeah.
My friend.
Hi, Armin Choksi. I have a question on this carbon tax, this border-adjusted carbon tax. Do you have any estimate of what impact that would have on reducing global temperatures? And the related question.
I think the answer is no, because I won't get into the modeling, but it's got to be, the question is there international take-up or not? And so our argument would be, with the U.S. being who we are, the U.S. economy leading the world to do a destination-based border-adjusted carbon tax, if only we do this, then the result is not much. If the world gets on this trend, which I think is far better than Janet Yellen's global min tax, then you're going to have a bigger outcome. So I think the question is whether you have take-up between just the U.S. or OECD or other countries. What this does is effectively, when you go to a destination-based tax like this that's border adjustable, you're getting a lot of fiscal space freed up because you're taxing the trade deficit effectively. and you're getting more revenue to lower our tax rates and have a better system for our economy. That's basically the exchange here.
But is there some estimate that if everybody takes it up,
Uh,
what impact that has? And my related question,
Yeah.
which is the reverse side of the coin, is to the extent that countries like India and China do nothing except pay lip service, which is what they're doing today, would it really matter whatever we do? Would it make any difference?
I think it will, because it will tax their exports based on carbon intensity.
In terms of global temperatures.
Oh, I can't answer that question. I don't know the answer. Kyle, do you want to take a stab at it?
I don't know the answer either. I
Yeah.
think you are right, that it depends on how many countries take up a carbon tax. And one of the arguments behind the border adjustment is it may encourage other countries to move in that direction.
Look, here's my theory. All democracies are taking up some kind of carbon policy. Even non-democracies are taking up some kind of a carbon policy. So the question is it sort of centralized industrial carbon policy, tax credits and subsidies for yesterday's technology? Not a real smart idea, in my opinion. That's what I hate calling this thing the Inflation Reduction Act. It's anything but the Inflation Reduction Act. Or do we want to be smarter about it and use market forces to send signals, price signals on carbon pricing, which is really a smarter way, and I don't know that there's an economist that would disagree with that. And being who we are, given that most countries are taking on a carbon policy, I would argue let's have the best carbon policy, the smartest carbon policy, the most economically efficient carbon policy, and the one that makes it less likely that we're going to crank up prices for poor people, the one that's going to make it less likely we're going to have, inflation on basic goods and services. Oh, and the one that makes it more likely through game theory for countries to join that parade of carbon taxes. By going to a destination-based system, you reset a system so that the incentive structure is for these other countries to adopt that kind of a system. Because if and when we do that, we are putting ourselves at an enormous economic advantage over other countries. And I would rather have a cascade of tax competition based on a more entrepreneurial pro-growth system than tax harmonization, where we browbeat each other to raise our taxes and not undercut each other. I'm with Ireland, and I'm not with the other European countries. Let them be entrepreneurial. Let them compete. Let them have pro-growth tax policies. By going to a destination-based system, I think you can do that. Send signals on carbon, which is half the world's going to be doing that. Why don't we do it the smart way? That's basically our theory. What it does for temperatures, I don't know the answer to that question.
Ross?
Ross, now the next panel, just.
Yeah, we give the next
Sorry.
panel, this is a preview of the next panel.
Sorry, just could you follow up on why, as a technical matter, this kind of carbon tax wouldn't raise, for instance, gas prices
No, it would raise
for American
but
consumers?
it would raise prices on carbon-intensive goods and services. But it is far worse better in my opinion than the kind of subsidies that they're talking about right now, than what cap and trade would do, or than just subsidizing all of these technologies that are today and yesterday's technologies. A carbon tax is designed to raise prices on carbon intensity. But what we're saying is lower corresponding taxes throughout the rest of the economy in a much smarter pro-growth way so that you can get faster economic growth. We're taking the corporate rate from 21 down to 15 in this bill, and we're having full expensing throughout the entire system. That is very good labor policy. That is very good pro-growth tax policy. And the carbon tax, which will raise prices based on carbon intensity, is paid for by having that corresponding rate reduction and expensing policy for the rest of the tax code. That's basically our point.
But maybe we'd phase it in pending the resolution of the war in Ukraine.
I want to ask Paul.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to get done, this year.
I want to finish up with just one sort of timing question for you, Paul. In the past, entitlement reformers, deficit hawks, people that were concerned about the long-term trend in spending and revenues, were kind of proven wrong because interest rates remain very low and we seem to survive. But do you think now, with inflation where it is and with interest rates rising, that we are truly in a different circumstance?
I do. The Federal Reserve hit the ball for the entire Great Moderation. So all those predictions or whatever, I remember I was on Bull Simpson and we were thinking it was right around the corner. Yeah. If the Fed keeps playing the game that they were playing, through all their asset purchases, through all their easing and their low rates, that was going to happen. But look what just happened. The whole thing blew up in our face. We now have out of control inflation, way more than transitory, and it's going to take the Fed, a good while to get this under control. And there's no way, in my opinion, we're going to avoid a recession to get there. So the question now, and just watch that CBO long-term budget the next time around. That's what's going to be really interesting, to see what their new long-term baseline is going to be. So I know this sounds like, crying wolf all of the time. The point we are making in this book is this is not a bunch of root canal economics. This is reforms that make things better. What we're trying to prevent is austerity and root canal economics. What these reforms do is make these programs work better, and using what we've learned in the private sector and in the 21st century to make these programs work better so that we can have an age of American renewal and prosperity, so that we don't have to have root canal austerity economics if and when, not really if, when that debt crisis occurs. Because the Federal Reserve, we've now just learned modern monetary policy was bunk, not true, didn't work, and here we are. So we are gone with the days of the Fed putting the thumb on the scale, and here we are. And that's I think, the point.
Okay, we're going to take a little break, and then we'll have the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
fiscally responsible.
Welcome back, everybody. If I could ask you to take your seats, I'd appreciate it. Thanks very much. And thanks to Paul Ryan and Angela Rachidi and Robert Dorr for the great discussion before this. It's great to have everybody here. It's good to be here with this distinguished panel and talking about the issues that we're talking about today. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at AEI, and really enjoyed reading the book. And if you haven't had a chance to do it yourself, I'm sure you will as well. It's a great contribution by a lot of our colleagues and friends, colleagues at AEI and friends of AEI. We're going to talk with this distinguished panel about some reactions to the earlier remarks and to the book's content, and then we'll open it up for some questions, and we'll be out of here by 3:50. So we'll move pretty quickly. And for those of you who are watching online, you can submit questions as well. You can do that in one of two ways, by email or on Twitter. By email, you send them to Thomas O'Rourke at AEI.org. That's Thomas.O''Rourke at AEI.org, or on Twitter at hashtag American Renewal. So hashtag American Renewal on Twitter if you want to send questions in that way, and we'll do our best to get to them. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away was a thing called the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Seems like a long time. It's been a long time since I've been on a panel talking about fiscal policy and entitlement reform and the like. And then something happened. It didn't actually succeed in the end. And then Paul Ryan became a vice presidential candidate, and we took a 10-year vacation, it seems like, from talking about these issues. So here we are. We're back, and I'm joined by a great group to do just that. To my right is Kay Coles James, who's currently the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Virginia, but also known to many of you for her senior positions in both Bush administrations and most recently the president of the Heritage Foundation. We're also joined by Ross Douthat, New York Times columnist, and also a non-resident fellow here at AEI and author of five books for now?
Something.
For now, 5 books. And lastly, joined by Maya McGinnis, who's the president for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and previously held different positions from Wall Street to Brookings to the Washington Post, and spends every waking hour thinking about these issues. So we'll get going here, and basically just asking for reactions from the panelists to what kind of struck them the most about the book and the issues that they want us to be thinking about going forward. And in my usual practice, I'll go alphabetically by first name. So Kay, take us away.
Well, thank you for having me here, and it's my first time being back in Washington since I left as president of the Heritage Foundation last December. And to be in a room of such scary, smart people is really exciting. So thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here. I think I have a sort of unique perspective on the book. Having been at the Heritage Foundation and had the privilege of overseeing research like this, and dear Lord, thank you for producing a book on policy right now while the rest of the country has gone mad.
Somebody's got to do it.
Somebody's got to do it, and I'm glad you did. So I've overseen research, developed policy, tried to translate policy into legislation, drafted regulations, and overseen programs. So I've seen it from the beginning of the funnel all the way to the end. And I don't say it in any gratuitous way, but thank you to AEI and thank you for the scholars that put in the time and the work to do the research. It is so desperately needed in our country right now that we are focusing on research, data-driven solutions to the problems that face our country. I have said often recently that a lot of what's happening in our country and the demise that I'm seeing happened on my watch, and I think our previous panel alluded to the fact that we've seen some massive deterioration in the last few years. I have committed to leave my grandchildren a country which is at least as free, at least as prosperous, and with some solutions. So thank you to the scholars who put in the time, effort, and research to do that. I will also say that I came at this with a little bit of skepticism as I received the book and was asked to sort of preview it. Having been at this probably for longer than anybody in the room, maybe about 40 years, going back and looking at having worked on the National Commission on Children, the Commission on Citizen Empowerment, served on the Sunquist Commission on Medicaid, having done welfare reform in Virginia, you've sort of been there, done that, seen that, tried it all, and become discouraged a little bit. Does it really matter to produce a book like this right now? Does it really matter to produce something that's full of ideas and suggestions? And while I am discouraged because of all of the hard work that's gone in over so many years, I am not discouraged because I think it is important to speak into this moment. Having said that, as a longtime advocate within the conservative movement, I think that this is an opportune time for us because we as conservatives and people who care about human flourishing, who care about these issues, need to understand that those individuals who are taking leadership in our country right now and who are promoting certain agendas don't really have the evidence-based research to back many of the proposals that they are suggesting. We as conservatives do. I self-identify as a conservative not because I care about winning an argument, but I really do care about human flourishing. I care about lifting people out of poverty. I care about the debt that we leave the next generation. And so ideas do matter. So again, I want to say congratulations to the team for doing this. Thank you for speaking into this moment. Thanks for not backing away at a time when many in our country are abandoning ideas and principles and values and are going more towards personality and power and control. But for those individuals who are here, who are dedicated to these important issues. And I look forward to discussing them in detail as we open up our panel.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for that. Maya, you spend your day, you and your organization spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. I guess I'm mostly worried you're going to tell us we left out something big, despite everything that's in the book. But what are your reactions to what you heard earlier and what you saw?
Yeah, I think I'll start at the same place, which it is so refreshing to have a serious, thoughtful policy book that's put out there. I was reading it as best I could before this event started, getting through an awful lot of it. And I just felt like, this is why I came into the world of public policy. It was so refreshing. It was really politics-free and great ideas. And so I just desperately hope that we can use this to jumpstart the discussion about serious policies again. Here, let me start with kind of the four big issues I think we need to be thinking about at this moment. And debt is one of them, but it's not the only one. So the first is and it's more not. Many of these are always true, but I'm thinking about the particular moment where the world is shifting dramatically from polarization, from technology, from the tensions we have in the globe. So the first thing is in terms of economic growth, it is more important than it's been before. We have many headwinds against us. I think it's critical that we come up with economic systems that still incentivize the things you want to: work, savings, productive innovation. And what I'm worried about is that we are moving on both sides, and I should say I'm a diehard political independent, we are moving on both sides towards a world where there's a lot of temptation from giving out checks, targeted tax breaks, rebates, debt forgiveness, all sorts of things where I think we are going to see the competition of both sides to bribe people to like what they're doing rather than good policies that are streamlined with the right incentives. And so I think that is one of the principles that underlies a lot of these issues. I think that's really important. I think we have to think about it even more broadly because I think there's a big risk. The second big risk or issue I think about is economic security in terms of the new threats that we're thinking, not just your normal, does the household have enough savings, but economic security as we're advancing. How do you deal with things like disinformation, cyber attacks, other technological weapons that are able to be used by internal actors, external actors, nation states, and individuals who can now have access to these weapons? These things are huge because they can bring down entire financial systems. And so when I think about the risks that we need to be addressing, that's a part of it. The third issue is how to ensure against the big risks of the moment. And we are still living with a social contract that ensured against the risks of last century. And so I really appreciate this book tackles how to reform a lot of those elements of the social contract. But these were the same ideas we needed 10 years ago and 15 years ago in terms of how to fix entitlements and other things. I think we may be at the point where we have to do a little bit more to blow up the social contract and actually shift a lot of our priorities towards the new kinds of risks that you're going to have while you're working, while the disruptions in the economy that are going to come more often, more regularly, and be larger are affecting and creating much bigger risks than just the risk of being underinsured or retirement. And the final is obviously the one that's near and dear to my heart, fiscal issues, deficit and debt. It is a huge threat in and of its own right. We had 10 years, Paul said this exactly right, we had 10 years where the macroeconomic conditions looked to not be really worried about deficits because of the activities with central banks, among other things, and also demographic shifts, other things were keeping rates artificially low, but we are incredibly vulnerable to growing rates. There's a risk there, but I think more troubling, the risk is that all these other threats, whether they're external, just from the fast pace of change, are not able to be addressed or funded when you're fiscally weak. And fiscal vulnerability, which is what we have now, leaves you unable to deal with any of the economic or national security threats and challenges that come along. That's the position where we are in. I hope this is the first step towards moving to get into a more secure place, but there are a lot of big disruptions in our own social contract that we're going to have to do to address that.
Great, thanks very much. And if I could just follow up very quickly, just on your third point on big risks, can you say just a little bit more about some of the ones that you're most concerned about?
Sure, for what a social contract needs to think
Yeah.
about? Yeah, so I think, you've always, basically you want a social contract to in many ways insure against the things that happen what insurance should do, things that aren't your fault, things that you couldn't have planned for. We now have an economy where because of disruptions and shifts in regional economics and where the advantages, what industries are working, how they're working, and how fast the pace of change is, that is obviously, we've been saying this for ages, but it's different than when you join a company, you stayed there forever. But we now have a situation where you are going to become irrelevant after you're out of college for 3 years, right? Like any of us who are older in the workforce know that the younger people, John Schuler is here, he has to help me do everything technologically in my office, right? You need the younger people to teach you how to do things. You're going to become irrelevant in much bigger ways than that more quickly. And so we need to insure against that. We need to insure against everything you've been trained about not being needed anymore as you have different technological innovations that are making that useless. So it's basically lifelong learning along with changes in your career track rather than the end of life, which is where our entire social contract is focused right now.
Good. Those are great thoughts and a lot there to continue to unpack. That's great. Thanks. Ross, you've been an observer and commenter of pretty much every debate reflected in every chapter in the book at one point or another over the last 20 years, sometimes a participant in the policy-making debates. Where's your head at right now?
Well, I would echo the thanks both to the speaker and Angela for putting all this together and to the authors. It is, in a way, a delight to go back into material that some of the ideas are new. There was less talk about cryptocurrency in 2013 than there is today. Had I only, anyway. But I could have made a lot of money and lost a lot of money, both, right. had I only been more focused on that. But there is a sort of sense of deja vu, right? A sense of this is the moment when a lot of work that a lot of people were interested in writing about, even defending to the readers of the New York Times 10 years ago is suddenly relevant again and sort of pushed into the political mix, I think, to a much stronger degree by current circumstances, by inflation and, sort of finally hitting the fiscal limits that we hit with COVID spending. So that, I think, definitely makes this book both relevant and timely. Since I write about politics, I thought I'd say a couple things about the politics of this stuff, just because I think the next stage beyond thinking about policy has to be thinking about, well, what would it actually mean to try and push these kind of proposals into actual law, right? And as I sat down here, I was, scrolling Twitter, as one does, and one of the things I encountered on Twitter was Tony Fabrizio, a Republican pollster, did a lot of work for the Trump White House and so on, commenting on the midterms and saying basically the lesson here is that Republicans should never touch the third rails of Medicare and Social Security. Again, that this is sort of the underrated reason why Republicans lost in, working class votes in Pennsylvania and so on, and which is to say, regardless of what you think about Fabrizio's particular polling, the political problem is clearly alive and well, right? And I think you can think about maybe usefully divide sort of the challenge into three parts, right? There is a set of issues and proposals and ideas in this book that I think you could imagine a competent and innovative Republican Party that held both houses of Congress and the White House pushing into law without sort of substantial political blowback, which is to say, I think, as the Republican Party did effectively on a bipartisan basis in the mid-1990s, I think you can do safety net reforms and welfare reforms without having it be a sort of third rail political moment where you put your majorities at risk. That doesn't resolve the specific questions like the great child tax credit debate about what exact form these reforms should take. But I think I can imagine a conservative majority sitting down and saying, we want to reform the social safety net to emphasize work, family formation, two-parent families, getting a bunch of ideas together, passing them into law, and it working. As I think you can see a sort of political path to that. On the big issues that, as the speaker mentioned, that are the real drivers of US deficits, the real problems for our long-term fiscal picture. We say Medicare and Social Security, it's really, I think, primarily Medicare. And it is both absolutely the case that putting Jim Capretta in charge of Medicare reform tomorrow would potentially save the program and open up all kinds of fiscal space for the United States, and probably also the case that 13 months after a Republican majority put Jim Capretta in charge of Medicare and these reforms were passed, it would suffer a devastating defeat in the midterm elections. Now that does not mean it's not worth doing. In fact, many things may be worth doing and reaping backlash for if the policy change is permanent. But I think if you're thinking about the sort of big picture entitlement reforms, deficits piece of this landscape, you have to think to yourself, what am I trying to do? Is my goal on the one hand to gain a majority, make these reforms, and just accept that there's going to be huge backlash, and also assume that there's going to be this cycle where basically Republicans do spending cuts, get punished at the polls, Democrats do tax increases and get punished at the polls, and the parties sort of take turns hashing out a compromise through basically single-party governance? Or do you want a scenario where you're actually trying to think, well, what are we willing to accept in are we trying to draw up the kind of bipartisan deals that famously John Boehner and Barack Obama were unable to come to? Like, are we trying to think to ourselves, what tax increase would we accept as the price of some of these reforms? I don't have a definite answer to that, but I think that's the way to think about the big picture entitlement reform stuff. You're either trying to do it yourselves and accepting a huge political backlash, or you're trying to sort of think in advance about what a bipartisan deal would look like. And then the final point I'd make is about bribing voters, right? The thing that you're worried about, because fundamentally, you could say that a lot of politics is the art of bribing voters in a way that redounds as much as possible to the common good, And that's, a crude and reductive way of putting it, but any kind of policy vision has to have a component within it that basically goes to some persuadable block of voters and says, here is how, in an immediate way, not a 40-year time horizon, but in an immediate way, your life will be materially better off if you support our program. Now, maybe in a climate of fiscal emergency, that, it's enough to say we're going to have a debt crisis and hyperinflation if we don't do these things, and that's how you're better off. Ideally, though, you want to work before you get to that kind of no-choice politics scenario. And, if you look back at every durable, lasting majority in American politics, whether it's the New Deal or Ronald Reagan, you can identify key policies from, anything from the original Social Security to Reagan's middle-class tax cuts that are the sort of durable, the offer that you're making to voters. And I think there are, sort of implicit offers contained within this book. There are ways in which reforms could yield immediate benefits for voters. But I think anyone who's thinking about dramatic reforms to reshape the safety net has to be thinking a little bit in that sort of admittedly dangerous but also politically necessary space of the swing voter in Pennsylvania or Ohio listening to your program, listening to your policy pitch, has to be able to identify some clear gain for them out of the larger program.
Okay.
You just described, for me, the frustration that I felt for 30 years. How do you take great policy, and by the way, hello, Jim, and I would turn Medicare over to you any day, all day long, and I know we would do well. How do you take great policy, and we have it in front of us in a book called Renewing America, American Renewal. I'm for it. But how do we get from the policy to actually getting it done? And I think that when you talk about it in political terms, and we put it in the political arena, we've already started to lose. And so I think that policy should be debated in policy forums, and we've got to figure out how to build a consensus around great policy, whether you're in the Democrat Party or the Republican Party. And one of the ways that I have chosen to do that over the years is to develop new language around it. And I actually, we conflated some things here on the stage already, where we've conflated Republican and conservative. They are not the same. Where I come from, that would elicit an amen. They are not the same. And being conservative, we have to sometimes make those arguments within, the Republican Party as well as within the Democrat Party. I can remember being on a Medicaid commission. I can remember being involved in discussions surrounding Social Security and the lockbox years ago. And I can remember being told we are on a burning platform, and that's going to drive entitlement reform, because if we don't, we're at the cliff, and then nothing happened. And I think that what we have to do as people who care deeply about good policy that is going to achieve all of the things that we all want, whether it's deficit reduction or entitlement reform, how do we build consensus in a country in order to move that from a policy discussion to actually moving it through the funnel, through to legislation, to actually implementing it through the programs that we care about? And so I think a part of what we need to have a conversation about, and maybe the next book will be, how do we move policy, great policy, evidence-based policy, research into reality? And it's for those of us who deal in the policy arena, we love having those conversations, we love having those debates, But for me, the rubber hits the road when we can figure out how to build the consensus. And I think that a part of that is going around the political establishment and going directly to the populace. So what that means is some of us have got to figure out how to take these very complex policy ideas and translate it into language that the ordinary American citizen can understand, build the consensus so that we can have the political stamina in order to make this policy real. I really do want to renew America. And I think that we have a great start with great ideas, great solutions, but if we can't get it to the next step, we still lose. And so I think that's vitally important for us to do. If I could tell you the number of times I've been engaged in conversations about entitlement reform, the numbers of commissions, the numbers of reports, so that is discouraging to me, but I'm at least delighted that we're back to having those conversations again.
Very good. Did you want to get in?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, go.
But
go.
do you want me not to get in?
No, go. Oh, yeah. Well, I always have all my questions, and I was just turning. I noticed you. No, go ahead. This is about your thoughts.
I think what pains me is that the moment for all of the ways we could have done this so much easier has closed. And we are already in the midst of the baby boomers retiring, and we are already in the moment where tensions around the world are so much deeper than we realized them to be 10 and 15 years ago, and we're going to have additional costs because of that. And it would have been easier if we had done these things sooner. But the bottom line with fiscal policy is that it is hard. You do have to cut spending and or raise revenues. And this book acknowledges that we have gotten to the point where we're going to have to do both, which are not enjoyable at all. And my favorite parts of the book is Ross may be one of the people I'm most fascinated to read, who I most often disagree with on this issue, I think. But my favorite parts of the book are the hardest ones, that are the political third rails. I love the fact, I told Alex this before, that Alex and Kyle's chapter on taxes is awesome. My favorite parts are the tax breaks they get rid of, the home mortgage interest deduction, the education credits, the healthcare exclusion, state and local. That's like the best part of the book. And that's what any political advisor would say. Don't say that out loud. I also love Andrew Biggs talking about means testing Social Security and not giving as much benefits where it's not needed. Like, these are the hard truths that we have to start talking about. And we also have to stop declaring that bipartisanship is a victory when it's both sides trading huge amounts of borrowing, which is what I fear we are about to see in the lame duck. I think it is going to be just incredible that in a moment of near record levels of debt, soaring inflation, we are going to have a bill that is probably going to have tens or possibly hundreds of billions of dollars of new borrowing for which there is no economic justification. So I think likewise the idea that it's a lot easier to bribe people to get things done is true, but for instance, I would look at the revenues raised from the border adjustment of the carbon, if it's a carbon tax. I would say you could give a small portion of that back to a corporate tax rate cut, but I think the moment for giving it all back is gone because we have waited so long. And I think if you don't start with the policy, the fact that we're going to have to make real choices to get the fiscal situation under control, we're going to continue to sell these free lunch myths, whether it's tax cuts pay for themselves or MMT or something is so darn important we shouldn't pay for it, when really if something's so darn important we should pay for it, that's going to continue. So I'm worried that we have to make those changes as quickly as possible. And I will just point out that sort of the fiscal policies we've had from the past two presidents, take COVID and put it aside because we needed to borrow then. But President Biden has borrowed almost $5 trillion since he has entered office. President Trump borrowed well over $7 trillion, and his promises were, I'm going to cut taxes, I'm going to increase spending, and I'm not going to fix Social Security and Medicare. That's what he did. And it led to $7.5 trillion of new debt that we shouldn't have had. So I just think part of what we have to do is bust open this whole myth that it's going to be easy and we can just kind of grow our way out of it. So I really appreciate the stark realities. The one thing I think the book is missing is I do think because it's focused on fiscal policy, it would be great to see how all these policies add up. I read it and I have no idea where you are overall, whether it's actually added to the debt, subtracted to the debt, against which baseline. So some sense of the comprehensive effects of these policy recommendations might be useful.
Yeah. No, good point. And I know in previous conversations with Paul Ryan, sort of in his mind, the next step is to start doing some of that as well.
That's great.
You know, so you
That's
should
great.
be involved in that. And no, we could spend all the time talking about the political feasibility of some of these things and what things would be easier to kind of start on now. But that's a long conversation, and it is just a real issue, and it's been with us. Like even when we were talking about these things over a decade ago, even some of the enthusiasm around, say, the Tea Party election in 2010 really masked resistance to these kinds of changes that were under the surface. We built a panel survey of 2,500 self-identified conservatives with YouGov back then, right before the election. And it was everything from the establishment types and the fiscally conservative, socially liberal, all the way over to the Tea Partiers themselves, social conservatives, Tea Party sympathizers. We had them kind of broken down. And what was interesting is the Tea Partiers were, as expected, always the ones that said government spending was their number one concern, Congress's top priority is cutting the spending. But when we asked questions about entitlement reform and specified, what Paul Ryan's ideas on premium support were or whatever, and how much do you support that, the Tea Partiers fell right back down to the establishment types and their willingness to support those kinds of things, because those were the days of, closing down USAID and closing down the Department of Education to get the budget in order. And when people had to really reckon with the reality, all that enthusiasm about getting government under control kind of evaporated pretty quickly back then. That was so even though it seemed like we were making progress, that political issue was still bigger, I think, than it felt maybe at the time. So that's a big issue. One thing before we go to questions and be thinking about your questions here that I wanted to ask about is stepping back from the specific policy proposals themselves. One theme that kind of runs through the book, this otherwise wonky book, sometimes directly or implied, you heard it in Paul Ryan's remarks. It's seen most explicitly in Nick Aberset's chapter, is this kind of theme of stagnation and malaise, sclerosis of institutions that demographically we're struggling. Our engines of prosperity are not firing as they used to. And then part of the promise of the book is that through these policy reforms that will actually help those issues. How much do you buy the stagnation thesis? Some call it decadence. So I might pitch this over to Ross first. And then how much do you think that these kinds of policy reforms can actually be stimulants for the kind of dynamism or whatever the opposite of stagnation is?
So I mean, I
there's the
wrote
stagnation thesis, but then there's a question of how much policy can really do about it.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book that came out just before COVID shifted things around called The Decadent Society, that basically argued that stagnation in all kinds of forms, not just economic, but cultural and political and so on, is sort of a defining feature of early 21st century Western life. And I think the answer to your question is I'm not sure, because the deep drivers of stagnation are not always obviously amenable to policy, right? Because it is, one of our challenges, someone, I'm not sure if it was Speaker Ryan or not, was talking about, workforce participation, right? And decline in workforce participation. That's a hard enough policy to solve, but underlying that is the fundamental collapse of birth rates all across the developed world. So it's not just, you're not just trying to get people who exist into the workforce, you're trying to get more people to exist in the first place. And we don't have a long history of sort of robust examples of policies that yield dramatically higher fertility. The speaker mentioned how, ideally we'd have a fertility rate, I think he said of 2.4. I would settle for a fertility rate of like 1.87. That would be an amazing achievement right now, given where how far the American fertility rate has fallen. So there is an underlying issues connected to social breakdown, family breakdown, and so on, that are really hard to solve. But there is, this is connected to the politics of it. The fundamental problem for conservative parties, not just in the US, but in the entire Western world, is that conservative parties depend both for their support, their actual voters, and for their sort of raison d'etre, their reason for being, on young people becoming sort of bourgeois, basically, right, for want of a better word, starting families, working steady jobs, buying houses, sort of following the success sequence, to use a think tank phrase, right? And one of the challenges created by this fiscal picture is that as a population ages, you spend more and more money as a society on old people, right? On other things that do not provide support for that transition. So ideally, from a conservative perspective, you would want to spend less money on Medicare and Social Security, and whether it's through economic growth or creative policy or both, spend more money supporting young people going through those life transitions that create, we think, human flourishing, certainly create conservative voters, Republican voters, both, right? But who votes for conservative parties? Older Americans. In the UK, this is all of the challenges that are sort of inherent in this book are magnified in Europe right now. You look at the UK, who votes for the Tory party? It's old people. What is the biggest problem in the UK? Housing. Young people, there's no housing. Housing is totally unaffordable. Who owns all of the housing in the UK and is very happy with their home values? Tory voters. So that's, I don't have an answer to this, but that's sort of the heart of the dilemma. You're trying to effectively transfer more wealth from the old back to the young, but the people who are voting for you are the older voters.
Which is why I believe for us to have success as conservatives, we've got to be able to articulate our policies to young people. And I believe that we as conservatives should lean into that, because when I talk to young audiences and I ask them about things that matter to them, and I said, what if I could bring you proposals that would actually provide access to health care in a more affordable way for a broader group of the American population, would you be interested? Yeah. What if I told you that I could bring you proposals that could, in fact, close the education gap and provide, close down the failure factories called schools and actually improve outcomes in education? Would you be interested? Yes. What if I told you I could actually bring you proposals that would move people through the success, what'd you say? Sequence, and take them from poverty into that middle class? Would you be interested? And they say yes. And what if I told you that I had policies that are based on research that tells me that can happen? Would you be interested? And they say yes. So I think a part of what we have to do as conservatives is to take what's in this marvelous book and translate it into language that is understood and believable to the young people in this country. And we should not hesitate to do it, because we have the answers to the things that concern them most. And we can win them, and we can get them, and we can win minorities as well with those messages. And we can take it from the think tank world, from the policy world, sell those ideas. I don't think we have to bribe people. I think we can win them. And I think we can win them with the ideas that we have, and that's why ideas matter. And that's why I'm excited that we are looking at ideas that will, and I think Paul said it best, and I forget the exact language that he used. These are conservative ideas, but they're not a root canal. They're not going to hurt. These are things that will actually contribute to human flourishing, lift people out of poverty, improve outcomes. And it's for those reasons that I'm a conservative. You know, it's not because I woke up one day and just thought, gee, that's a nice group of people to hang around with. These ideas matter. They change people's lives. And so, you know, it's an important work, yes, but the one thing that I would like to do more of is to see how to take these ideas and sell them in the marketplace, not just to policymakers here in Washington, but to those individuals out there across America who love this country and want to see us flourish and to see us renewed.
Very good, thanks. Well, with that, we will turn to some questions for those that have them. I will say, just to plug one other study from here that we did with Brookings, to Ross's point. Just this past year, we had a working group report that went through the policy exercise of trying to say if we could rebalance our federal social spending from old people to young people, what would that look like in a budget neutral way? And we did this with Brookings, and I think the results are pretty interesting. So if you're interested in that issue, like, it doesn't solve the politics side of it, obviously, but the question of, like, if we were to do that, what would something like that look like? And I think it's a pretty interesting exercise. Okay, let's go wait for the microphone to come to you and just make sure your question is in the form of a question. Yes, sir, right here.
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Jaden Klubeck, and I'm from the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream. I'm very intrigued by this concept of articulating conservative ideas for young people. And so I'm curious to just hear everyone's thoughts of what is the conservative plan of managing student debt for college graduates? Thank you.
Who wants to go
Anybody want
first?
to take?
Well, I'll jump
Why
in.
don't you jump in? That's
Well, first of all, managing student debt, that gets pretty close to bribing when we say, in fact, we're going to get rid of your debt and hopefully that will bring you in and you will then be more likely to listen to the rest of our agenda. At the end of the day, I would, first of all, I have a philosophy, which is I would never, ever promote a public policy that I would not promote in my own family. Public policy and private policy for me are one and the same. So what would I say in my own household to that? Student debt. We have to go back and work with young people and help them understand the consequences of taking out debt that they have no idea how they're going to pay for. And I would ask those questions of my own kids, asking them to be responsible to pay back debt. I'm not going to bribe you and tell you that I will pay it for you in order to win you over. I think I have to work on character. I think I have to work on your own fiscal responsibility and your understanding the importance of not incurring debt you can't pay. And those are conversations that you can have privately and both publicly. So I am not a fan of getting rid of student debt to win student voters.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would just say, I would start with maybe the opposite of what we just saw. So out of the blue, unpaid for debt forgiveness, that is regressive, one time off, so that in 5 years we were going to have the same amount of student debt all over again. It does nothing structural to improve the system. That would not be the answer. And I also think there is some irony in saying we are going to get rid of student debt by borrowing around $600 billion and passing that on to those same younger people because none of it was paid for. What I think we do have to do is figure out how to make the benefits, the costs and benefits of higher ed as transparent as humanly possible. I think you have to make public the returns that people get on their education. I think you have to look at the kinds of programs like income-based repayment plans so that you can be paying as a share of your income, and we have policies that do that already that I think are about to be worsened in some of the changes that we're likely to see. And you have to realize that in every area that we subsidize through the tax code, and again, back to the Kyle and Alex chapter, why I like some of the tax base broadening they did so much, every area, housing, healthcare, and student and education, where we try to subsidize it through the tax code, what we do is we drive up the costs. So the reason that higher ed is growing, the costs are growing so much faster than the economy overall is because of the way that we subsidize it in the first place. So the less we do that, the more market discipline there actually would be for people deciding what's a good investment and not.
What she said.
So I quickly, I agree with the sort of joint critique of what the Biden administration actually did. I do think, though, that precisely because the government has subsidized debt, it is very understandable that young people look at the debt they've taken on as something that they were effectively encouraged to do by economic policy. It is their fault in some sense, but if you have a policy that encourages people to do something, you can't then necessarily sort of shake your finger moralistically at them when they do it. So with that in mind, what I think you're looking for is basically mechanisms that make it easier to repay debt that penalize institutes of higher education that are the ones that are sort of the government's partners in this policy. I'm not enough of an expert in this area to say whether, say, making student loans dischargeable through bankruptcy or these kind of things. You know, I don't know what exactly the best policy is, but that's the zone that you're looking at, I think, ideally, if you want a conservative answer to the Biden proposals. You're basically saying, how can we make it so that it's a little easier to pay off debt in ways that instead of the taxpayers being on the hook for it, the universities running rip-off master's degree programs, which they really just are. And I mean like Ivy League institutions, not like University of Phoenix. Like universities are essentially predatory on government policy and on students in some of these cases. And I think there are things that conservative policy can say about these. I also think, since I am the briber on this panel, that that conservatives should essentially found a bunch of new universities using public money, put Mitch Daniels in charge of running them with a mandate to keep costs as low as possible, and with the faculty selected by a bipartisan committee of academics appointed jointly by Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. That is my preferred higher education reform. We should have 10 cheap national universities managed in part by the Republican Party for the sake of keeping costs down and ensuring ideological diversity. And that is not a policy that any politician has taken up yet, but I like to get it in whenever I have a captive audience.
And I'll say what he said. I love that.
All right, good.
That's a great idea.
Didn't something like that start down in Texas?
In Texas, yeah. University of
Yeah.
Austin.
Yeah.
Well, that's, yeah.
More complicated, but.
Yeah.
Very good. Any questions from the floor here? I have one from one of our viewers online asking the question, when exactly does debt and deficit spending become politically unpalatable to a critical mass of Americans?
Does it ever?
That's the question.
Well,
Does it take a crisis?
Yes. I mean, I think the reason that we're having this conversation again for the first time, really, not that
I sat alone in a room
you
and
sat
had
alone
that
in a room
conversation,
and
right.
were annoyed at my columns. But yeah, is that it's, I mean, in this sense, Speaker Ryan said, you know, well, the modern monetary theory types have been proven wrong, right? But one thing the modern monetary theorists said that was correct was that it was politically correct. That's not the right word, but they were correct about the politics. The constraint on deficit spending is inflation. When you get inflation, deficit spending becomes politically unpalatable. Now, where the modern monetary theorists were crazy were that they said, well, and once you get inflation, the government will just, you know, cut spending and everything will raise taxes and it'll be easy, right? No, it doesn't get any, you want to avoid the inflationary scenario in the first place precisely because it's so hard to deal with. But that is the constraint. Now, ideally, you don't want the direst scenarios, and the hope would be that you can get reasonable fiscal reforms under moderately inflationary conditions rather than a true debt crisis. But I think, yeah, you absolutely need some form of pain being imposed for.
I'm concerned for my grandchildren, because what is that trigger that will make people take the debt crisis seriously? How bad does it have to be? How bad does it have to get? And throughout my lifetime, I've seen certain points where I said, this is it, people are gonna get sick, and it never happens. So I'm fearful for what that looks like.
Right now, real wages are going down because of inflation. I think that's sort of the minimum, I think, for what you need to get voters. But the problem is still, if you look at polling from the midterms and people say, I'm very concerned about inflation, what would you like to do about inflation? I can assure you that, you know, fiscally responsible reforms are not super high on the list. So it doesn't resolve the problem of how you do things, but it does like actually bring it to voters' attention in a way that, absent inflation, just doesn't seem to be the case.
So we did do polling on this issue quite some time ago because I was curious what would make people care about the issue. And I assumed it would be their kids. They'd be worried about their kids. That the thing that did make them pay interest rates above what is projected, that's going to increase our interest payments $240 billion a year. That's more than the entire Trump tax cuts, right? So these are huge amounts of money. And so I do think that our vulnerability with this huge, broad base of debt, and the reason I was worried, everyone said don't worry about debt for so long, is we kept adding to it. So now we're this much more vulnerable. But with this amount of debt, any change in interest rates will have a big increase in interest payments. Interest payments already run families over $3,000 a year in terms of if you look at allocating the budget per family or household. So it is probably a moment where people will care more, but Ross is completely right that they care, they nod, they're in it until you tell them what it's going to take to fix it. And my belief, because I look at this policy before politics, is we have to just keep telling them, we have to be honest, it is going to take spending, entitlement reforms, revenues, they're all going to have to happen. And if we continue to only worry about what's good politics, we will not be able to make these issues change because it's going to be hard. But I think we have more of a moment than we've had in a while.
Very good. Well, one word to wrap up with, I'll note just in our own survey work that we do, we've been finding over the last couple of years that when it comes to the issues that really animate everybody, but especially younger adults in this country, it really has to do with these issues of affordability, that basically your income to cost of living, which is mostly housing, that ratio, and then the last couple of years, public safety. And so you can look at survey results and see where people land on every hot button issue on the right and the left. But when you ask questions about the intensity with which people care about those things, the intensity over the last few years has been entirely on these sorts of cost of living things. And that matches what we see when one of the things I do is I look at where 25 to 35-year-olds move and why. And when you look at why people are leaving New York and going to Nashville or leaving San Francisco and moving to Denver, it's really driven by these sorts of issues. And that's where the intensity really is. So there's a lot in this book too about trying to make these reforms to make people's quality of life better. And it seems to me like when it really comes down, where the rubber meets the road is to somehow personalize these issues in a way that people feel it sort of in their own pocketbooks. And that's going to be a little bit easier to do with some of these issues than others. But I agree with you that we're at a time where we can talk about these things in a way that we haven't been in the last few years. And so it's been fun to do that today with all of you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being interested in these issues. And please join me in thanking our panelists today for this great discussion.